kind of the varieties of how self-talk has come about in athlete life. It's more understood as a widely used phenomenon. And so it's pervasive across competition, in practice. Athletes say they use it in individual sports, on teams, before and after critical events, and even during, we might add. And those happen at different levels. Athletes themselves report that they use it as short phrases for quick movements. So it might be something that they're using, again, strategically. And then there's reasons why they might do it. It's a psyching up mantra, it's a psyching up strategy. Or they might use it to think about a mistake that they've made, right? Post-match kind of analysis. So athletes report a variety of reasons for why they use self-talk. And as the field has evolved in defining sort of different aspects of what it happens within the context of sport, the field has come to better understand that, look, there's times where athletes use talk spontaneously, usually in reaction to something. It's something organic that comes about from the sport itself. So there might be self-talk in tennis that doesn't relate to self-talk in basketball, or self-talk, at one level of performance that doesn't relate to another level of performance. It's something organic about the situation. And it's also goal-directed, right? So there might be utterances, there might be things that all athletes could say to themselves to improve their performance. And again, this comes from sort of the early days of like, can we use this to improve performance? If you think to yourself, does my self-talk influence the outcome of something? You're not far off. You're actually on to what the research suggests. So what does the research suggest? Well, overall, several studies have been published, and enough so that a body of literature has been analyzed through a technique known as meta-analysis, in which you look at the effect of a particular intervention, for example, on performance at the study level. And based on a sample of those studies, the effect is overall positive. It's a somewhat medium effect size, right? Which is, by all accounts for behavior, it's fairly impressive. These are, to give you a little bit more context on how this happens, these are studies in which athletes or students as performers are randomly assigned to a intervention group in which they receive some program that helps with self-talk, or a control group, a comparison group. And then they're given some task to perform within the context of the experiment. Maybe it's like a target practice task. You're serving to get specific points in a zone, and you need to use techniques such as, turn your shoulders, or swing down low, right? Like ground strokes. That's kind of where this is coming from. And they compare those two groups on their outcomes. And again, the overall effect is that it's positive. It varies, however, by the type of self-talk that's going on. So let's get into a little bit more about the concepts of self-talk. Well, there's instructional self-talk, which is sort of the commands that one engages in as you're performing something. And then there's motivational self-talk, that kind of psyching up, increasing one's drive, persistence to perform an activity. Instructional self-talk tends to be more effective overall for performance than motivational, at least this meta-analysis revealed. But there's also a difference between fine motor and gross motor performance, where fine motor tasks tend to get a little bit more of a bump in terms of their effect on performance with self-talk compared to gross motor. And if you match instructional self-talk to the appropriate motor task, like you really kind of line up the instructional phrases that you might say to do fine motor movements or gross motor movements, that increases the effectiveness of that intervention. And you can also do pre-training versus no pre-training, right? So actually getting athletes to practice with the phrases prior to the intervention does in fact help the overall outcome. Okay, so that's where the primary focus of sports psychology has been, on self-talk. Another corner of the research is focused on observing athletes in their natural context. So that's just what it sounds like, going and spending lots of time observing what athletes do when they play games, when they play matches, when they go throughout their season. And so the research has examined things like tennis self-talk and what relation it has to the overall game performance within a set of a tennis player. There's even research examining the relation between self-talk of a receiver and a server, and kind of the dynamic that goes on between those two individuals within a tennis match, as well as self-talk predicting overall averages performance of a gymnast on balance beam performance. And to summarize that literature, it's mixed. The self-talk literature in this naturalistic context, as we'll see, does in some cases predict performance, but not always in the direction that you would expect. In general, however, the idea is that self-talk does influence performance. Okay, so that leads us to kind of this idea of building somewhat of an understanding, a theory, right? Some kind of model. And this is where self-talk in sport is very currently. So you're kind of seeing this in live action. And so self-talk predicts behavior. Well, that's it. Everybody can pretty much shut it down. You've come to my talk and you've seen it. It's pretty much definitively answered, right? Just kidding. Not exactly as you would think is this model going to go, but there's other things that we need to consider about what is it that makes self-talk so influential in sports. And researchers like Judy Van Ralt, as well as myself and a couple of other people in Europe, have sort of gone back and forth about what is the model for self-talk in research. Judy's model is really interesting in that she was the first one to kind of think about these individual and contextual factors to arise within the athlete's everyday performance when they really take the field. And it's probably from her work of doing a lot of observations that she's seen this in action. And so kind of take you through this model. You know, we can think about behavior as being the performance side of things, but self-talk's used in a variety of settings, as we've seen just a moment ago with the self-report of athletes. But you can talk about the context influence of, well, what does the athlete do in practice versus competition when they're in a difficult situation and they just lost the prior point versus they're winning and they're on a streak. Those contextual factors do in fact matter. The personal individual factors, kind of dispositional factors, are, do you talk to yourself a lot or maybe just a little bit? Are you aware that you talk to yourself? So are you a believer, right? It's like a sort of many people talk about it. You believer in the power of positive thinking, as well as some individual factors that relate to perhaps the athlete themselves, such as their personal motivation for playing sport, the nature of how they think about themselves as an athlete. So it's very much kind of a self identity aspect of self-talk as well. And though I'm not necessarily going to focus on those things all together, the model itself overall says, you know, we need to be considering all these multiple factors because that's where the research is pointing. It's also important to note that even though self-talk is represented as this one, I guess you could say, homogeneous construct, I hope you have gathered so far, and I've done my job nicely, that it goes by different things. And so self-talk, it can even be broken down into different pieces. It's different pieces of a puzzle. And so the concept itself might be important to explore for researchers. And that's where I come in. I look at self-talk from the developmental side. And I'm going to play a video of some classic research that's done by my advisor, Adam Winsler, that kind of starts off this aspect of what the research in developmental psychology and how they think about self-talk or private speech, which is what developmental psychologists term. So hopefully you can hear my screen.
I know I like these ones. They're both purple.
Oh.
green, so I put green there. They're both fishies. They're both dogs. Both blue.
Okay, in the interest of time, I want to stop that video and just sort of point out a few things that this study is early days in some of the private speech research from that work that my advisor has done. And what you're essentially seeing is you're seeing children work on what's known as what they call the selective attention task. It's very basic. It's just categorize these things by their matching features. So the kid has to sort of look at the task and go, okay, I see a similarity here. It's this, not this. And there's some distractors as well where they kind of have to suppress some of that information. And you probably notice some things about what's going on. The kids kind of out loud, just sort of narrating what's happening while they're doing this task. Maybe you notice some other things as well, which is that as the child begins to get a little bit more fluent with the task, they start to change the things that they're saying to themselves. And it goes from very, very fully articulated speech as one would be engaged in a full presentation of what they're thinking to more condensed utterances: green, blue, chicken, square, triangle. And then this kid right in the end here, this as a comparison, is starting to do more of that muttering and silent verbal lip movement. So in general, the research suggests that there is a process of development that happens in the kid as they're doing a task with their self-talk. What does that tell us? Does it just tell us about their behavior? Does it tell us about some other things? Of interest is this idea that self-talk for the early child between the ages of 3 and 4, specifically in this study, and primarily the focus of much research on private speech has been on early childhood, is this trend of internalization. So children start overtly with predominantly kind of voicing their thoughts out loud, and then they begin to engage in these what are called partially internalized speech, or muttering movements, condensed speech, as I mentioned before. And at a certain point, usually about the age of 4, there's complete internalization. So what that suggests to us, at least from a developmental perspective, is that that is a key period of what happens within language development, as well as kind of the child's overall thinking. Internalization means that maybe not for the first time, but for a big time, I can now think in terms of words, and I can use those words to symbolically represent what I'm thinking, right? Now, this doesn't necessarily just restrict itself to young kids. Although this internalization process is really important, it happens within this time period of 3 to 4. It also happens with a child performing a task. They get a little bit better and they start to internalize. But it also happens extended out over to adolescence and even adulthood. The trend lines here, giving you the overall picture, are one of internalization, where speech is primarily overt in younger age groups. And as those age groups kind of go on, when the x-axis there increases, the kid gets older, that internalization starts to increase over time. There's some fluctuation and variability. In fact, there's some interesting data that point to the idea that language, again, when the child reaches about school age to middle childhood, resurfaces, private speech resurfaces as being overt, quite possibly because another sort of reorganization of thinking is happening. Nonetheless, the trend is of internalization. With internalization happens developmentally, and it signifies some important things. An early thinker who pioneered this idea was a guy by the name of Lev Vygotsky. I'm sure you've probably heard of him in many of your psychology classes with Dr. Lynn and Dr. McIvers. But private speech, according to Vygotsky, is a thing that represents the internalization of thinking, fusing language and thinking together. And so we can talk about it as being an important thing that happens within the everyday actions and performance and situations that a child is in. Why not talk about it in other contexts as well, not just like in the video that you saw or maybe in a classroom? The things that we need to consider are that, well, does this internalization happen, in other contexts? Is it a part of maybe young athletes and what they do, as well as what it relates to in other spheres? Some of those other spheres, according to Vygotsky, or other areas that are related to private speech are, where are you on the scale of development? What do you call ontogenetic changes? Where is the development of language within the child, what is known as microgenetic, or just speech itself with those tasks that you saw, the selective attention tasks? What are the changes that happen in speech over time? That's another example of microgenetic change. There's also the social, cultural, and scaffolding of speech that take place at a much larger macro level. And those things contribute to private speech as well. Competence in a peer or competence in a good scaffolding adult will increase the private speech of a child and quite possibly facilitate, in many cases it does facilitate the thinking. And by thinking, Vygotsky, as well as other developmental psychologists, have referred to other terms such as executive function, self-regulation. Those are kind of related to performance. Development of self-efficacy and mastery. Self-awareness, or awareness of one's own thinking, and do you talk to yourself? And all of these things are sort of broadly speaking related. And the point is that there's a lot more diversity than just looking at self-talk and whether or not it predicts performance, because we've got to consider all of these things in the context of a major milestone for private speech, for self-talk. The other thing I want to add to this is that there's diversity in differences about different populations. And so when we look at adults, private speech in adults is still present, but in many cases, what it is a signal of is maybe perhaps a difficult or a relative lack of competence or mastery in a given level. There's research pointing to the idea that adults who struggle with literacy tend to use more overt self-talk when they're engaging in literacy type tasks. Children with exceptionalities, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder also engage in more overt private speech when they're problem solving through tasks as well. And so there's some, interestingly, they can be probably the most helped by good scaffolding. In fact, Adam Winsler's early research with boys with ADHD showed that when you had the presence of a really expert scaffolder, you could connect the kid with ADHD to sort of take the speech and their own self-regulatory or lowered self-regulatory capacity and improve it. It's like the scaffolding served as a link for that child to increase their verbal directed performance. So that's a lot of background literature. And, to summarize the focus of this is that there is, this current knowledge base suggests that there's intervention and performance differences with relation to self-talk. Kids engage in self-talk to direct themselves, but there is a lot of variety in that type of speech. In some cases, it indicates that they're doing well. In some cases, it might actually indicate that they're struggling with a task. For sports, particularly within the context of tennis, it's a unique position to look at self-talk and perhaps even look at its development. And so the areas that I explored in much of my research to date has been about young athletes and observing them in various contexts, specifically looking at tennis players. And how does what they say to themselves in the natural context of their sport relate to the things that I've mentioned before? What do athletes report saying to themselves? Because that's a really important thing to establish. If the kid is reporting that they generally say positive things to themselves and they talk a lot to themselves, do they actually engage in speech when you're in that context of interest? And does it match? Does it match up? What's the relation of self-talk to performance? Becomes part of that work as well. So I'll show you a little bit of the research, hopefully the main results of that today in the time that we have. So during most of my work, in the context of my work, I did my dissertation work at George Mason University. And I spent a good deal of a couple of years observing tennis players and following them through their camps. And we recruited a sample of these participants. And pretty much to summarize, a lot of time in the summer spent, we did a lot of coding and a lot of information gathering from these tennis players about their self-talk, to which, again, I'm going to present some of the results. But we had accessible to us this sample of tennis players who were fairly serious, fairly advanced for their age, but we had a wide age range as well, from 9 to 17 years old. It took place primarily at a summer camp that was in the area and formed a lot of the work that I did with my dissertation. You'll see some of those kids in a moment. One of the things we did with them was give them some self-talk surveys. So we asked them, how frequently do you talk to yourself? How much of that stuff is out loud? How much of it is inside of your head? And then asked them to fill out a standardized survey, validated in the literature, by the people who've done a lot of intervention work about the types of negative and positive self-talk phrases that they did. So they would endorse how frequently they said things like, I'm going to lose versus let's go, or today I suck versus don't get upset. And those are generally categorizable by negative and positive, as well as other functions of self-talk. Primarily what we did, though, the most amount of time we spent was through coding and observing just about everything that we could see within these tennis players. And so my advisor was just like, go out there and get everything you can. We spent, it wasn't just haphazard, though. Thankfully, we had the literature as a precedent to define what self-talk is. So we use that approach from a systematic point of view of like, well, how did these researchers define self-talk? What are the important relevant characteristics of when you're looking at this from a live and in-person standpoint? So we did that. And then I spent a fair amount of time before data collection, just going out into the field and observing what tennis players do as kind of an independent and hopefully unbiased observer. We coded the speech that they engaged in through video and audio wireless combined several sources to determine self-talk, as well as the different categories. And I'll take you through each one of those. So here I have a sample of what it looks like from a transcript, which is just literally a fraction of all of the speech that we coded. I'm gonna play this clip while I'm kind of talking to you through it. It's sort of a distraction. This isn't necessarily the speech of this kid, but this is what you're looking at as an average coder and private speech researcher, as you're looking at these instances of players engaging in drills, practice drills. They're warming up, they're doing specific structured drills, they're lining up as a team or maybe as individuals.
40, 30.
We just followed them throughout the entire process to get all of this coded. First thing we did was we decided, okay, what is, in terms of each thing, is an utterance? Can we define what an utterance is? It's a complete thought that contains information enough to be separate. So those are each of the lines. It's an utterance of speech. And then meticulously went about coding whether that utterance was private to the self or social. By process of elimination is really where you want to focus your definition. As I had mentioned from the very beginning, private speech or self-talk is kind of a process of ruling out whether or not you're talking and using social markers of speech. So we get to the private speech using multiple audio sources. Then we decide, okay, what what are the next categories of interest? Well, emotionality is something that points to different categories of speech, right? The normal positive, negative, and we added neutral as an aspect of speech without any clear emotional, we called valence on the speech. We coded each private utterance as being positive, negative, or neutral. And then we added another code to determine what the function of that speech might have been based on what we were reading, which is it motivational? Does it seem like it's something that relates to drive and persistence and increased self-efficacy or desire for mastery, all these kind of aspects of what motivation is coming from the literature? Or is it instructional? Something a little bit easier to define in terms of tennis, because usually that's like a direct command. It's like, hit the ball there, but arguably there's some gray areas. And so we had to make a lot of decisions on distinctions at each stage of the coding to make sure that we were reliable. And just for the sake of presenting that, to make sure that we're really rigorous, that coding is highly reliable to the extent that it's possible. Typically what you do is inter-rater agreement on these codes to make sure that you are coding accurately and other people do agree consistently with that coding scheme. So we then took these codes and started looking at the themes. The themes overall are that players, when observed in the sport context of youth tennis for this sample, overwhelmingly engaged in a majority of negative utterances and some positive utterances and some neutral utterances. And then when we looked at kind of the function of that speech, primarily what we were seeing was not necessarily motivational or instructional, but just largely these kind of eruptions that we called reactive speech. Reactive speech was something that without clear motivational or instructional content, and it's just kind of this like, oh, oh God, that happened in the moment. A lot of mistakes do happen, and so that tends to be what a reaction is. Rest of it we couldn't necessarily get from audio sources being somewhat bungled at times. But the majority of the speech that we did observe, we were able to code. Overall, it was about 95% of the speech utterances that we had were codable. And so we could even hear those small utterances whispered underneath the breath that other people may not have gotten just from sort of observing without any technology. So that was an advantage of our work in that regard. So we captured a lot of speech and exhaustively coded it. One more thing I want to point out, which is kind of that note of what this speech is what speech is measured. So we call this the median proportion of private speech. So this is all private utterances, and that's the percentage of each type of utterance aggregated over all the observations. So it's a large swath of observations aggregated into one. And we had to use the median proportion because if you might sort of know where I'm going with this with statistics, basic statistics, we had a lot of variability in speech. Some kids did not talk to themselves at all. Many kids talked a lot to themselves. Some kids were just kind of in the middle. And in many cases, the speech categories we had, there was so much variability in range that we had to use the median. This variation was much larger than the average. And so the median was the best measure of central tendency in this case. And so that's what we used to kind of look at other aspects of our data. So the big question we were interested in is, do these types of speech that we see in the field, like in practice when those players are engaging in self-talk, and what they report, do they line up? Is there an association between those two things? Because something has been bothering us in the literature, which is what we know about self-talk in an athlete is mostly by what they self-report, not by what's observed in the setting. Most of what we know from the intervention literature is based on self-report. They don't observe the athlete engaging in the self-talk, even the ones that are given the program to do it for the experiment. It's just, did you say the things that we taught you to say, yes or no? Well, if you're orienting to this table, we've got self-report measures that we gave the athletes on the column here, and then across we've got the categories of private speech, not all of them, but the main ones of interest across the top row there. By and large, the associations were non-significant. We did find a trend that players who were observed to talk more themselves reported that they tend to do more of that stuff. So there's some coordination between at least saying, yeah, I do talk a lot to myself when I'm in tennis, out loud, in fact, and the nature of actually observing that speech in the context of where we saw it happen. But in terms of positivity, of saying, I'm generally a positive person when I talk to myself, or I'm negative and I say these phrases, they didn't really line up. Correlations were near zero. And if you're interested in more about the statistics of that, this is for this type of study, this is an amply powered study, and so we essentially failed to reject the null hypothesis in that sense, right, with ample power. So those speech sources, they don't line up quite as well as we'd like them to. Let's look at the observed performance, and let's look at the observed speech and what it tells us about athletes. Okay, so the next portion of this study we conducted was observing a subset of these players engaged in match play. We took a subset of them, we coded them for their self-talk and their performance using what is known as a self-talk and gestures rating scale. Again, there was precedent for that. And what that essentially is it's a survey, a checkpoint. Players engaging in self-talk, each point that they play in a match, and the outcome of that point. So you're watching this little guy here.
Come on!
Do something.
Stupid swing.
And he says in the end, he's like, oh, come on, that was a stupid swing. Well, we code the speech that he says as being negative in that instance, or it could have been positive. And then what was the point outcome in the match? We had video and we had live, and so we did kind of compare the sources. Did he lose the point? Did he win the point? And we did this for every point within the match. Here's another example here. I'm going to go ahead and pause that one. Just kind of show you, where we are with how we do this. It's largely, hopefully, a consistent approach, standing by the court and coding these things. And in the context of this camp, we had some additional factors, like we had to wait for the kid to get back to the court. And we had to determine, this is a really interesting piece of this, we had to determine the timing of it all, because yes, the kid is playing a match, but it wasn't a usual match. And so when do we start the coding? When do we code one point versus the next? That's all kind of involved in this naturalistic coding. Not only are you interested in what facets of behavior you're coding, you want to establish a time sequence that's really clear as well. So we said something along the lines of, well, when the kid exits the court, that's when the point ends and the next one is going to begin. So we start to code the speech for the next point leading up to that interval, and so on and so forth. And it goes on and on. So that's the match play self-talk. The overall results of this, or that self-talk and the point outcome, were related. And so we decided to do this analysis that looked at the multiple levels of self-talk, speech, and performance. So there's a lot on this table. I'm going to orient you to it, which basically says, on the column, we've got what happens within a match from point to point to point, and so on. Those points are interrelated. They're sequences of events that we should treat as interrelated. They're not independent. So one thing should lead to another. And then at another level, we're looking at, is there a difference between the player that was in this match who talked to themselves compared to another player who was in their match and didn't talk to themselves on the point in question? Okay, so that's level 1 and level 2 of what is known as a hierarchical linear model, respectively. And what we can see from the results is that within match play, we see some correspondence between speech on one point and the outcome. Negative self-talk tended to occur when the point was most likely to be lost. So it happened more often on points that were lost as compared to points that were won. That probably is no surprise. And then vice versa, an increased probability or an increased likelihood of winning the point was associated with using positive self-talk on that given point. Instructional self-talk actually went in the same direction as negative self-talk. And we can comment on that, in a moment, but that's essentially the results of what happens when the kid talks to themselves on the same point that they just played. So we kind of think of this as like a reaction to the point itself. We didn't necessarily find that there were differences between players, but within a match, there were these associations that happened, right? This kind of buildup within a match observed. When we looked at the very next point, the point in question right after the one we observed, then we start to see some associations that self-talk may in fact predict future performance. It's marginally significant or trending in the case of negative self-talk, where there's a decreased likelihood of winning the next point. And in positive self-talk, there's a increase, statistically significant, at least by this data, that the player has an increased likelihood of winning the next point, given that they said positive something to themselves on the prior point. Now, this is the difference again between one player and the other. So overall, players who did talk to themselves positively tended to outperform players that did not talk to themselves positively, at least on the next point. But I want to, draw a caveat here as a researcher and not overstate these results. If you remember, the effect size of interventions and performance was fairly medium. If you look at the effect sizes or the standardized measures, which is that OR, that odds ratio, and the confidence interval, it's not really that large. In fact, it's very near 1, which is, for this type of model, almost no prediction at all. So it's very small. I'm not going to overstate how just impressive these results are. And it's quite possibly because there's so many different factors going on. One of the things we did do to make sure we were honest by our models, we controlled for the prior point outcome. So what happened in response to going into the next point, as well as the length of the tennis match that the kid played. So even with those factors in the model, this was still what the results showed. Okay, so we can at least sort of speak to this idea that there is an association, but it's maybe not what we expected. So let's return though to this model that I brought up in the beginning, which is, what is self-talk in relation to performance, as well as these other things? Well, I think we need to kind of separate self-talk as being something that is either self-reported and retrospective, and it's very nice and neat and clean, or it's messy and in situation observed, like this naturalistic performance and overt speech, a lot of the speech that we coded, that's spontaneous to the situation. Those things might be related, but our results suggested that by and large they're not. So they might be independent facets of self-talk for youth sports and in other contexts as well. And then there's some interesting conclusions that we can kind of draw from the idea that self-talk, as far as self-report is concerned, might be related to individual dispositions, such as motivation. Some of the research we did in fact point to this idea. Or it depends on how immediate it is the player just performed something. If you ask them about what they said to themselves right after the match they played, it may relate to the context of that speech. Okay, so there might be some correspondence there. Observed speech does in fact relate to the context. This is ongoing and it's in development, and it may also be related to the individual disposition of the athlete in terms of, are they aware that they're engaging in that speech? That's the self-report data did confirm that as well, that some players maybe seem to be more aware that they're in fact doing this thing out on the court for their game. But the behavior and the speech seem to be more in favor of this idea that if we collect data in an ongoing developing environment, that's where we get more richness. That's where we get more indication that the speech is influencing performance, not necessarily removed many, many times over from, the previous match that they might have played a week ago or 2 weeks ago when you self-report. So there's some interesting conclusions to sort of develop and think about. The construct of self-talk, as I mentioned, is still sort of in development. People are approaching it from different mental models, if you will. You've got the developmental camp that I'm coming from, which is saying, we should think about private speech and development. There's a lot of diversity. Judy Van Ralt in her research says speech needs to be observed in the moment, in the context, and there's also a lot of diversity. So there's some agreement there. And then there's a group of people in Europe right now, Alexander Latinjak and his group, that are looking to sort of more chisel out this categorization of broad speech taxonomy. And his issue with the research that not necessarily the research that I've done, but with the literature at large, is that one, the self-report stuff isn't indicative, but we shouldn't necessarily say that it's, you know, it's dead and gone because we've failed to validate it with observation. We should still sort of continue to use it, but look at developing better measures, better improved metrics of speech. So there's different arguments that are kind of going back and forth, and it's all from different mental models that we do approach this. The last thing I wanted to say, because I know we're coming up, is with regard to self-talk, you know, there's some critical aspects of what youth sport and self-talk has implications for that. Self-talk is important to develop because around the age of middle childhood, developmentally speaking, we get a higher level of specialization and a higher level of attrition than in any other age cohort. So that's a critical point in the development of a young athlete. Coaches and parents also during this time tend to put a little bit more technical demands and pressure, and they also tend to back off in terms of the emotional support and maybe even control the athlete a little bit more than they had previously, right? And so that research by, the research in question actually by Travis Dorsch is looking at, you know, parents' involvement in the development of mental skills in youth sport is really critical because that's a really foundational psychosocial event for that kid, right? And so what are we going to do in terms of the practical applications of my research as well as other people's research? Well, maybe we could look at how social agents like coaches and other adults could benefit from professional development within the idea that, you know, you can in fact encourage self-talk and use it to improve motivation and performance, but you have to do it in a way that looks at what the kid is doing in their natural context, and you scaffold it and you bring that into how they internalize their speech, you know, for their own performance, rather than trying to use a one-size-fits-all intervention. So, you know, consider the coach-athlete dyad as a place where we can start to look at developing programs, you know, that, and I don't want to necessarily say programs as a buzzword, programs that might influence individual athletes and their development of sport mental skills. So really quickly, because I've spent most of the time talking about self-talk, but I want to get into this stuff about what I'm doing currently. I'm at the Blanco Center, and I've been here since August, working as a senior research associate, and have thoroughly enjoyed the new process of being a part of this research community, where we focus on evidence-based approaches within areas of policy and practice that affect Louisiana as a state. Specifically, we focus in the areas of these listed areas ranging from education, anywhere from education to performance in other domains of sectors of the economy and government ethics. We're interdisciplinary. We've got a team of data scientists and research associates. I was brought in as a developmental psychologist. I have a background in applied developmental psychology, and I'm interested in how programs work to influence children's development, and really speaking to this idea of being a researcher who can communicate to policymakers and practitioners. So we do in-depth research, but we also look to communicate to other stakeholders and engage with other audiences. We do that through in-depth research activities in these various areas. My focus right now is on the Child and Family Services Department in Louisiana, DCFS for the acronym, and the Child Welfare Office within foster care and adoption, and specifically the evidence-based practices for what is known as Families First Prevention. So it's really interesting to see a lot of the things that I study as a psychologist being put into the game, into the conversation of, well, what kinds of programs would improve the developmental outcomes of these kids in foster care or prevent them from entering the foster care system in the first place? What evidence-based approaches can we use with scaffolding the parent to improve kids' executive function and self-regulation? That is where the rubber meets the road for me as a researcher. So we do that through policy briefs as well, and we provide assistance to agencies that are looking for it. So we've got a lot of ongoing projects, and I'll mention one extra thing here that we're, some of you have gotten the job ad forward. We're hiring more research assistants as we speak and looking to grow the team here. So thank you so much for listening today. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much.
Got enough time for questions.
Yeah, no, I think we can open up for some quick questions.
Christy, I think Christy,
yeah.
looks like Christy.
Jordan, Dr. Jordan, I wish I had met you a gazillion years ago. I am a tennis. I'm a sports fan and I love tennis. I'm not gonna go on my rant, but did you happen to consider the impact of observational learning with respect to self-talk? As you were talking, and it's amazing you showed this video, when the little guy said, "Come on," like that's a Serena thing. Like that's how I know Serena's hype. Yeah. She's motivated, and it's motivational and it's instructional with her. And yeah. I also thought about like the transition with tennis in particular, how just grunting was kind of frowned upon, like don't make any noise, just let the ball hit. And it's like now you see these young people, come on, like they're becoming little Serenas, and I don't know. So I get the self-talk. I love the self-talk. But did you guys kind of look at observational learning and how that's playing a role in self-talk?
Well, the specific work that I did, only looked really at kind of the perception of the child, the youth athlete, and their perception of kind of tennis, looking at it at motivation and from the coach's perspective, like they perceive the coach as being able to help them with that. We didn't look specifically at observational learning, but there is some interesting, aside from the intervention literature that actually does model this kind of self-talk. I agree with you that there's sources of self-talk that are cultural, that are out there from the sport cultural perspective, especially within tennis, which has had a long tradition of being focused on being mentally tough and, and being the Serena and being the Nadal or the Djokovic.
Yes.
And the research in that is really interesting. There's some work done by Judy Van Ralt, as I mentioned before, and some of her students, that is asking players, where do you get your self-talk from? Who is the source here, right? Are you watching TV? Are you talking to other people, other players about what they're doing? Other media sources are obviously involved. Have you been trained to think about it that way? That kind of stuff. So you're right in that. That's a very good question to ask.
And then quickly I'll share and I'll mute myself again. I think when you look at it across different sports, how self-talk can be viewed as a bad thing, coming off of the World Series, like the only thing these people do is they do like hand gestures. So like you don't say anything. So it's just, this is just so fascinating how in one arena, self-talk is a good thing. It's valued, it's inspirational, instructional. And in other sports, like you don't say anything. You might be called for a taunting penalty. I don't know, but I'll shut up. Great talk, Dr. Jordan. I loved it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. That's all fascinating points you raised. Absolutely.
Before we let Dr. Lin ask questions, is there any students who want to ask questions? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. No? Okay, Dr. Lin, your turn.
Okay, I have two quick clarification questions. The first
one,
when you were talking about coding, you exhaustively coded the behaviors. And my question was about instructional self-talk and motivational self-talk. You treated them as mutually exclusive?
So we did treat them as exclusive for a reason that the present time of the literature, that's a primary distinction within most of the literature setting precedent. And so I kind of have a commentary on that in that, I hope that clarifies it, in that motivational and instructional operate in two distinct domains with the literature. Do I think in practice that is the case? I don't think so. I mean, it is going with the precedent, but it's also getting further and further away from that murky reality.
Mhm.
And so you could have instances where someone says, hit the ball harder next time,
Yeah.
and that could be have some motivational undertones to it, right?
Exactly.
And I think that there's more to be said about sort of the spontaneity of that type of speech. And people have different opinions on it within the literature. I think, from what our coding system showed in practice is that we try to line up that taxonomy to these neat categories of what athletes self-report in a structured inventory.
Mm.
We're getting different things.
Right.
So I hope that answers your question. You said you had another question.
It's helpful. Thank you. Another question has to do with the regression analysis, the variables that you input. Why didn't you include motivational self-talk?
Oh, that's a clarification question. I am sorry. We were looking at just the performance in match play. And that was for a subset of players. And we did not have, with that standardized measure, we did not include a motivational code. We used the canned coding system. So that's a limitation of that analysis, is that it doesn't necessarily include all aspects of self-talk. Just the primary positive, negative, and instructional, which was developed by Judy. So it does raise a point of, could there be better assessments, which we're including that increase this kind of ecological validity of the assessment. And I think that the fact that we're debating how neat and clean these codes are, as well as did we include everything for the facets of behavior of interest, it definitely raises a question of, well, can we develop better coding systems? So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I love those questions. Those are great.
Great. Oh, okay. So some folks in the chat are saying that we have to leave. Is there any other questions before we wrap up? Yeah, Cheyenne, please.
I have a quick one because it's at time, but I'll email my other ones. But what opportunities have you seen for ways for your previous research, such as this, to incorporate that into your current role at the Blanco Public Policy Center?
I've been thinking about that question a lot, actually. I think so. If you want to follow up in an email, because I might have more to say than we have a time allotted. But as I mentioned before, my training is in applied developmental psychology, and primarily the focus of that degree is doing research as not just a researcher, but a member of a larger community of policymakers and practitioners. So you learn. Scholarly research has its rigor, has its standards, has its sort of purpose. But when you interact with the world of policy and practice, it gets a little bit more into the weeds of, well, how do we implement specific designs to, say, improve outcomes for kids in program X for the state of Louisiana? And that is very much related to psychology, in that we're looking at child development. We're looking at between the ages of 0 and 6, do these kids increase in executive function skills when we give their parents, who are at risk for maybe, high levels of stress and potentially other clinical issues? How do we look at this program implemented day in and day out? Well, you start from the psychological process of, I know about the psychology, I know the basic research behind what's good executive function, what's child development, how important is the parent in terms of that interaction and attachment, all of those things come into play. But then there's a way that you've got to go about communicating that research to people that you're working with, like a Department of Child Welfare. How do they think about the research? How do they think about what the program means? They want to see good returns on their program. So you got to match that up. And that's a skill that is definitely desirable, and it's worth learning. It's probably the hardest thing to do. I would say the research is relatively not as hard as being able to communicate what that research means to other parties. And so that's really a lot of what we do here, as well as kind of trying to find the ins and outs of, well, we don't have a perfect randomized controlled trial for this program. We still need to look at the data. So what's left? Can we look at other types of models, right? Can we look at other models that exist out there that don't have this pure comparison or control group. So, and it's probably getting a little bit too much into the technique there, but that's like how I relate that is I am now sort of a basic scientist also in the position to communicate that to other stakeholders.
Wonderful
Make
answer.
sure to send out a follow-up email. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Great. Any other questions? If not, then we'll end it here. I'm sure Dr. Thibodeaux will be fine with anyone reaching out to him to ask him more
Please email if you
about
have any
research
questions.
and Blanco Center research. So, yep, thank you all for being here. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.